Here are the Monday Countdown headlines. There is a day in each failed presidential campaign where the losing candidate wakes up with his chances of becoming president still intact, but goes to bed with them irrevocably destroyed. I think for Trump, that day was yesterday. The viability of his candidacy has largely depended on his growing support among Latinos. This was Trump's warm-up act yesterday at the rally at Madison Square Garden, New York.
These Latinos, they love making babies, too. Just know that. They do. They do. There's no pulling out. They don't do that. They come inside, just like they did to our country. Republicans are the party with a good sense of humor. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
That is a inaccurately self-described comedian named Tony Hinchcliffe. It is literally possible that Tony Hinchcliffe just clinched the election for Kamala Harris. Hours earlier, ABC News had reported polling, while giving the vice president a national lead of 4 points among likely voters, that her support among Hispanic voters had been 12 points, 55 to 43, at the start of this month, but that it had now grown to 64% to 34%, 30 points over Trump. The lead nearly tripling in 3 weeks before that idiot said what he said. And Latinos or Hispanics, or more accurately and respectfully, the various groups that make up a diaspora of connected heritages, are hardly a uniform voting bloc. But this moron Hinchcliffe managed to offend them all and single out Puerto Ricans. 450,000 residents of Pennsylvania self-identify as Puerto Rican. 127,114 of them in Philadelphia. 33,531 of them in Allentown. 100,000 residents of North Carolina identify as Puerto Rican. 65,000 in Wisconsin. 50,000 Michiganders, to say nothing of 1 million Floridians and 250,000 Texans. And of course, there's that other issue. 12% of likely voters nationwide are Hispanic. And by the way, about that 1 million in Florida, within 4 hours of this bonehead Hinchcliffe's career ender, and I mean career ender for Trump, Miami Congresswoman Maria Salazar and Florida Senator Rick Scott repudiated Hinchcliffe and the joke and the insult. Rick Scott, Voldemort's less well-known brother. Even Rick Scott realized what a disaster this was for Trump and MAGA and the Republicans and this election. As to everybody who is not Hispanic, don't worry. Trump hates you too. You are still part of the enemy within, which he mentioned yesterday, again and again and again and again. You are part of that group along with the Latinos and blacks and Jews and Muslims and transgendered and Democrats and injured military and media and critics and judges, because the final masks all fell away yesterday and they all reveled in their racism, and the raging, murderous hate came pouring out in a way that would have shamed the previous American Nazis who soiled the stage at the previous Madison Square Garden in 1939.
America is for Americans and Americans only.
That was Stephen Miller, Goebbels without hair, Trump's personal fountain of hate, screaming, "America is for Americans and Americans only." Had this been true in 1905, when Stephen Miller's ancestors were trying to escape pogroms in Russia, yearning to breathe free, they would have died, tempest-tossed, or at the Cossack's sword, and Stephen Miller would never have existed. Incidentally, America is for Americans and Americans only? Stephen Miller just called for the deportation of Melania Trump? Of Elon Musk? Of exhuming and removing Trump's dead mother? Oh, and just to make sure everybody was covered, a speaker made a joke about, for Halloween, how African Americans were carving not pumpkins but watermelons. And the music they played right before introducing Congressman Byron, "What the F am I doing here, Donalds?" It was Dixie, the Civil War anthem of the Confederacy, the most racist lines in the most racist song of the 19th century. There are no more masks. It is an absolute fact that each losing presidential candidate has an expiration day. Often it is election day itself, obviously, sometimes days or weeks after. Ask Al Gore or Governor Sam Tilden from 1876. Sometimes it won't be identifiable for weeks or months until after it happens. Mitt Romney made his remarks about the 47% on May 17th. David Corn published the tape on September 17th. Romney still seemed viable as a candidate on October 17th. No, he was done on May 17th. McCain lost on September 23rd when he inexplicably suspended his campaign in a stunt in which he claimed he had to instead go deal with the 2008 fiscal crisis as if he were not competent enough to do both at the same time. The same day he bailed out of a free hour of one-on-one network TV publicity with David Letterman and lied to Letterman about what he was doing instead and wound up watching in horror as Letterman could find only one other political guest at what was literally the last minute before the taping started, and that guest was me. If yesterday's was Trump's swan song, it came with the most bitter of ironies. Although that, too, is part of the tradition of, to paraphrase the film The Sweet Smell of Success, your campaign is dead, son. Get yourself buried. The ironies here. In Philadelphia, a 2-minute Trump commercial during the telecast of the Eagles football game, seen by all of those Puerto Ricans who live in Philadelphia. That 2-minute commercial was about how the country had gone to hell under Biden and Harris and their presidency. The video was of protests during the Trump presidency. And the irony back at the Garden, Trump didn't really say anything unusual for him, didn't say anything outlandish, didn't say much noteworthy, probably didn't say the worst things said all day. But there is a danger when you change the background, when you alter the colors, when you swap out the venues, when you, in effect, improve the lighting. For nearly a decade now, the Trump rallies have gotten less and less shocking each time because to the majority of America, why would it still be shocking that Trump could fill the stage behind him with hateful trash in Tupelo or Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, or Zebulon, North Carolina? After a while, the parades of local politicians who have prostituted themselves to touch the hem of Trump's garment all blend into one. Of course they did that. They are racists now, racists tomorrow, racists forever. But just as the German-American Bund discovered in 1939 when they paraded the swastika into the old Madison Square Garden here, there is something about parading Trump's backed-up sewer of hateful has-beens where people can see them. Hulk Hogan is still alive? Elon Musk? Dr. Phil? Tucker Carlson? You brought them into the heart of bright blue New York City to scream their filth? Somehow that context, that location, underscores that they not only believe this, they not only see a future only for white people and others who have been approved by white people. They not only think they are a majority, they not only think Trump is beloved, they not only think the tens of millions of us who repudiate their bestiality and their hatred and their racism are somehow just pretending to repudiate these things. But most of all, worst of all, these scumbags think they're going to get away with it. I mean, they got away with it last night. Police protection, private protection, guns, and not what would have happened otherwise, thank goodness. Not one of them was dragged off the stage by New Yorkers and beaten senseless. Or better yet, gently escorted to Bedloe's Island and chained there overnight with their eyes taped open so they would be forced to read Emma Lazarus's poem in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The essential point is, because of the context, there was an actual surprising quality to that thing yesterday. A corporate ethics expert once noted, as Rupert Murdoch and his board of directors and executives and other whores publicly tried to avoid all responsibility for Rupert's hacking of the voicemails of a murdered child. The corporate ethics expert said, "I don't think they realize we can see them." Ever heard of Charles Lindbergh? Charles Lindbergh was the first man to cross the Atlantic in a solo flight. From the day he landed at Le Bourget Airfield in Paris on May 21st, 1927, he was the most popular man in America and probably in the entire world. Even as he began to speak out defending Nazism in the late 30s, he was still in the top 5 most popular, at least. And then he went to Madison Square Garden on October 30th, 1941, and he insisted the only threat to America was the Jews and their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, our government. And Lindbergh insisted there was no true threat to America by any foreign power. And 39 days later, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And 4 days after that, Hitler declared war on us. And when Charles Lindbergh died, first off, there was applause and cheers. But secondly, the obituaries were all about his Nazism first, and the airplane thing second. You know whose obituary is going to read like that? Elon Musk's. Lindbergh's hate was not born that night at Madison Square Garden, October 30th, 1941, and it was not born in 1939 when the German-American Bund went to that place. And it wasn't born in 1927. What was born at Madison Square Garden and what was born at the new Madison Square Garden last night was something that had become dulled or paved over, or maybe we had never recognized it before, or we could no longer see it because the background was, bluntly, somewhere you and I would never go city. What was paved over was the shame. The shame that Donald Trump has brought us. The shame that these perverted, warped, barely sentient racists live here. The shame that we have to end on November 5th. And look, it's not just shame and vibes and shock and blowing whatever margins you had among the Latino and Hispanic voters. Were it that easy, Trump would have been pushed onto the next down escalator in 2015, and by now he would have long since arrived in hell. There are also the practicalities. The ABC Ipsos poll yesterday did put her up by 4. The Big Village poll closed last Wednesday, Harris by 7. And I don't believe that any more than I believe any of the Trump garbage polls. However, as I always suggest here, and I think the theme of the last 2 months, follow the bouncing polls, confirms, the interior numbers of polls can be of actual value. In the ABC poll, likely African-American voters are now hers by 90 to 7. The CBS poll, which came out yesterday, has her up by 1 nationally, despite something curious in the very first interior number. She leads among women by 12 points. He only leads among men by 9 points. If that difference is correct, she wins handily. And the New York Times Siena poll, a month ago, its respondents gave Trump a 13-point edge on handling the economy. The edge is now 6 points. The Times poll also claims that 15% of the electorate is still not fully decided. Those leaners, likelies, probablys, Harris 42, Trump 32. I have already underscored the late decider data from the Emerson poll last week. This just confirms it. Late deciders are going 60% for Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is closing. Will this show up in all the polls? Probably not. If it does show up, don't worry, they'll weight it differently to make sure it doesn't show up. Will it show up in the election? Probably. There are paths to the Electoral College in which it doesn't matter, and it didn't happen in time, and Trump still wins. But as I said at the start, not if enough people hear what Trump's minions said here in New York yesterday. Not what Trump said, what that guy Hinchcliffe said. God, we have to build him a statue here outside Madison Square Garden. At minimum, so the pigeons have something new to crap on. I have a friend on the campaign, and originally I thought to start this episode with a vaguely clouded up version of his optimism and confidence at this late date. And then I heard a clip from somebody else on the campaign, and I was genuinely surprised because this other person is not only one of my friend's bosses, but this person has, from the start of the campaign, been portraying the Harris campaign as the underdogs. And all of a sudden, this person has switched her tone completely.
It's very exciting. The number of young people, I've begun to really point out the first-time voters who are there, is now people are actually registered, and it's very exciting, and the momentum is with us.
I know that voice from somewhere. A quick thought in passing on the cowardice of the owners of the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. L.A., it's the Times. For more than half a century, this has been true about whoever has run the L.A. Times. They could F up a 2-car funeral. As to the Post, what? Bezos kills the routine, nobody but Trump would have even noticed post-endorsement of Harris? Then Trump immediately gets to meet with Bezos' rocket company? Coincidence, no doubt. I have mentioned it many times, always in praise of Bezos, that he resisted the attempt to blackmail him into throwing the Post towards Trump when they tried to blackmail him over Lauren Sanchez while he was still married. See, now I'm a pretty devious guy, at least in thought. Seldom in deed. I'm kind of ashamed of that. But I have to confess, what did not occur to me was, what would happen if Trump's cronies were still blackmailing Jeff Bezos? Are still blackmailing Jeff Bezos? Well, he'd bury a Washington Post endorsement of Kamala Harris, wouldn't he? Back with a full edition tomorrow. Until, good night and good luck.